The summer of 2011 had painted Yellowstone National Park in its most enchanting colors. The sprawling valleys shimmered under the golden sun, pine trees whispered in the breeze, and geysers hissed and steamed like breathing giants from the Earth's crust. It was a season of discovery, a time when thousands of visitors flocked to the park, seeking not only adventure, but also peace among the vast wilderness. Among them were Brian Matayoshi, a 57-year-old man full of quiet enthusiasm for nature, and his wife, Marilyn. For the couple, Yellowstone wasn't just another tourist stop. It was a chance to immerse themselves in the raw, untouched landscapes of America's first national park, a place where the rules of civilization gave way to the primal order of the wild. That July morning, the two set out on the Merry Mountain Trail, one of the park's renowned paths, winding through meadows and dense stands of lodgepole pine. The trail had a reputation, long, solitary, and frequented by the very animals that made Yellowstone both breathtaking and dangerous. But to Brian and Marilyn it was an invitation to step into a postcard scene, away from the noise of highways and towns, into silence broken only by birdsong. They moved at a leisurely pace, the crunch of their boots blending with the soundscape of wind and distant rivers. Brian, dressed in hiking gear and carrying essentials in his pack, seemed relaxed, though always aware. Marilyn walked beside him, keeping her gaze on the trail ahead, occasionally glancing at the tall grasses and wildflowers that framed their path. They spoke little, not out of discomfort, but because there was something sacred about the quiet. Every turn of the trail unveiled a new panorama, rolling green fields spotted with bison in the distance, the jagged outline of the Gallatin Range, and the unmistakable sense that they were walking through an environment that hadn't been tamed. Yet beneath this serene surface, Yellowstone carried another truth, one often mentioned in cautionary signs and whispered by rangers. This was bear country. Encounters with grizzlies were rare but never impossible, especially in summer when mothers guarded their cubs with a fierceness unmatched in the animal kingdom. Still, the couple pressed on, comforted by the belief that such tragedies belonged more to the realm of warnings than reality. After all, it had been a quarter of a century since the last fatal bear attack in the park. That fact alone seemed to carry a false sense of security, as though the land itself had offered a quiet truce between man and beast. As they advanced deeper into Merry Mountain Trail, the air seemed to thicken with solitude. Few hikers ventured here, and for long stretches, Brian and Marilyn were alone in a wilderness that stretched for miles in every direction. The grasses were tall enough to sway against their waists, and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground. Then, at a bend in the trail where the view narrowed and the forest pressed in closer, something shifted. It was not a sound loud enough to startle, but rather the subtle tension in the atmosphere, the kind that makes the heart quicken before the mind fully understands why. The rustle of branches came sharper, closer. A shape, low to the ground and moving with a raw, deliberate power, emerged ahead. In that instant, their serene hike transformed into a moment suspended between awe and dread. Before them stood not just the symbol of Yellowstone's wild majesty, but a force of survival itself, a grizzly bear. And she was not alone. Two small cubs lingered near her, making the encounter infinitely more dangerous. The moment Brian and Marilyn's eyes locked on the bear, time seemed to fracture into shards of disbelief. There she stood, a massive grizzly, her fur a blend of dark chocolate and sunlit brown, her muscles rippling with each calculated movement. The cubs, barely more than bundles of fur with playful, clumsy steps, stayed close to her flanks, unaware of the storm of fear crashing over the two humans on the trail. For the bear, this was no chance meeting, it was an intrusion. In her world, proximity to her young meant danger, and danger required an immediate, violent response. The air itself felt charged, as if the entire forest leaned in to witness what would unfold. Brian's heart pounded like a drum echoing through his chest. He knew enough to understand that grizzlies were unpredictable, and a mother with cubs was the most dangerous encounter of all. The signs posted throughout Yellowstone had warned of this: avoid startling them, never approach, and most importantly, do not run. But now, confronted with the raw enormity of the animal before them, all the words of caution shrank beneath the crushing weight of instinct. Marilyn's breath hitched, her eyes darting to Brian, searching for guidance, for some sign of safety in this sudden storm of peril. The bear's head lowered, her dark eyes fixed on the couple, her nostrils flaring as she caught their scent. For a heartbeat, it was as if she measured them, calculating the risk, the threat, the distance between her and her cubs. Then came the sound that froze their blood. A guttural huff, low and resonant, a warning carved from the primal code of survival. The cubs shuffled uncertainly, pressing closer to their mother's legs, and then, without hesitation, the massive grizzly surged forward. The world exploded into chaos. The bear's charge shattered the silence of the trail, her paws pounding the earth with terrifying speed. Brian, instinct overriding logic, turned and bolted down the path. Fear had hijacked every ounce of reasoning, his mind reduced to the single, desperate command to escape. Marilyn, caught between terror and paralysis, called out to him, her voice trembling, but the roar of the grizzly drowned out everything. Within seconds, the massive predator closed the distance, her body a blur of power and rage. Brian's attempt to outrun her was futile. Grizzlies could sprint at speeds of up to 35 miles per hour, faster than any human could dream of escaping. As his boots pounded against the dirt, the sound of her charge grew louder, closer, until it was no longer behind him. It was upon him. The grizzly collided with Brian in a violent crash that shook the trail, sending him sprawling. Her weight pressed down like a boulder, her claws slashing, her jaws snapping with primal fury. Marilyn screamed, the sound raw, desperate, echoing through the trees. From where she stood, paralyzed by horror, she could see the bear's immense frame towering over her husband. Brian's cries mixed with the terrifying roars of the predator, the scene unfolding like a nightmare carved into daylight. Marilyn's instincts screamed at her to run, to flee into the cover of the forest, but her love for Brian rooted her in place, even as the reality of the attack became undeniable. Her body trembled, torn between the will to help and the overwhelming knowledge that to intervene would mean certain death. And in that moment, surrounded by the indifferent silence of Yellowstone's wild expanse, the unforgiving truth of the wilderness revealed itself. Survival often came at a merciless cost. The forest around them seemed to vanish, consumed by the horrifying scene unfolding on the Merry Mountain Trail. The bear's massive jaws clamped down with terrifying force, her weight pinning Brian to the ground. Each second stretched into an eternity as Marilyn watched in shock, unable to reconcile the man she had walked beside just moments ago with the brutal struggle now beneath the predator's claws. Brian's cries were ragged, desperate, and cut short by the bear's overpowering strength. The sounds of the attack, bone-crunching snaps, guttural roars, and the thud of paws striking earth were a symphony of terror that carved themselves into Marilyn's memory. Adrenaline surged through her body, igniting the primal instinct to survive. The forest no longer seemed peaceful. Every tree now looked like a barrier, every shadow a potential hiding place. She had to act. Yet the human heart wages war against reason in moments like this. Every fiber of her being screamed to help her husband, to throw rocks, to yell, to distract the bear. But another voice, the cold whisper of survival, warned that even the smallest movement could draw the grizzly's fury toward her. She froze, torn between devotion and instinct, knowing that the wrong choice would mean both of their lives. Suddenly, the bear lifted her head, her dark eyes scanning the surroundings. For an agonizing second, Marilyn felt those eyes pierce through the brush, locking onto her as if weighing whether to finish what had begun. Her breath caught in her throat. her heart hammering so loudly it seemed impossible the predator couldn't hear it. But the cubs rustled nearby, whining softly, pulling their mother's attention back. With a final brutal swipe of her claws across Brian's body, the grizzly seemed satisfied. She stood over him for a moment longer, her massive frame heaving with the force of her breaths, then turned slightly toward her cubs. This was Marilyn's only chance. Moving with the stealth of someone who knew a single misstep meant death, she slipped into the tall grasses lining the trail. The blade scratched against her skin, but she welcomed the sting. It was proof she was still alive. She crouched low, trembling, forcing herself not to look back, not to hear the dreadful silence where Brian's voice had been. Slowly, carefully, she pushed deeper into the vegetation until the trail was no longer visible. She huddled there, heart pounding, every nerve alight with fear. The minutes crawled, each second a new test of patience and terror. She could still hear the bear moving, the sound of heavy paws crunching against the earth, the huffing breaths of the massive animal as it lingered with its cubs. Every shift in the wind carried the predator's scent closer, and every rustle in the leaves threatened to give away her position. She pressed herself to the ground, praying silently that the bear would not notice her presence. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the sounds began to fade. The bear, satisfied in her defense of her young, ushered the cubs back into the cover of the forest. Marilyn dared not move, not yet. Her entire body shook as she clung to the grass, her mind caught between disbelief and grief. She wanted to scream, to cry, but she knew that silence was her only shield. Somewhere behind her, the love of her life lay lifeless, claimed not by chance, but by the unforgiving laws of Yellowstone's wilderness. And Marilyn, now alone, understood with chilling clarity that survival in this vast, untamed land demanded a price she had never imagined paying. When the forest finally grew still, Marilyn remained hidden in the grass, paralyzed by fear and grief. Minutes felt like hours as she pressed her body to the earth, afraid that even the sound of her breathing might summon the bear back. The wilderness, which had seemed so majestic only moments before, now felt suffocating and hostile. Every rustle of leaves carried menace. Every crack of a twig was a warning that death still prowled nearby. She clenched her hands against the dirt, grounding herself in the harsh reality. Brian was gone, and her only chance of survival was to outlast the silence and escape unseen. Her mind raced through fragments of memory, the laughter she and Brian had shared that morning, the way he had admired the rolling fields along the trail, the warmth of his hand clasping hers. It seemed impossible that those moments could vanish so suddenly, replaced by a nightmare so vivid it would haunt her forever. Tears blurred her vision, but she dared not make a sound. Somewhere in the distance, the grizzly grunted softly, a signal to her cubs. Then came the steady rhythm of retreating footsteps, fading deeper into Yellowstone's wilderness. Only then did Marilyn allow herself the faintest breath of relief. But relief was fragile. She knew the bear could return at any moment, drawn by a shift in scent or a sudden noise. Gathering her courage, she began to crawl forward, moving through the thick grass like a shadow. Every movement was deliberate, her body screaming for speed, but her mind demanding silence. The trail stretched behind her, marked now by tragedy. But she could not look back. To look back was to invite despair, and despair was death. After what felt like an eternity, she reached a thicket of trees that offered greater cover. She crouched among them, her heart still pounding like a war drum in her chest. From here, the world seemed cruelly unchanged. Birds still sang overhead, a breeze still carried the scent of pine and earth, and the sun still filtered through the canopy as if mocking the horror she had just endured. The serenity of Yellowstone was indifferent to her pain, just as it had been indifferent to Brian's final moments. Marilyn forced herself to think beyond the grief clawing at her chest. She needed to find help, but the Merry Mountain Trail was isolated. Hikers could go hours without crossing paths with another soul. Her options were limited: remain hidden and hope someone stumbled upon her, or attempt the long trek back toward safety, risking another encounter with predators along the way. Neither choice offered comfort, yet survival, once ignited, refuses to let go. The instinct that had kept her silent in the grass now urged her forward. She rose slowly, scanning the surroundings with wide, fearful eyes. The trail stretched like a scar through the wilderness, a reminder of what she had lost. But it also offered direction, a path that could lead her back to safety or into further danger. Gathering every shred of strength, Marilyn stepped onto the trail once more. Her body shook, but her will was unbroken. With grief as her shadow and silence as her companion, she began the lonely walk back, each step carrying her further from the scene of horror and deeper into the uncertainty of Yellowstone's unforgiving embrace. Each step Marilyn took along the Merry Mountain Trail felt like walking through a dream blurred by grief. The wilderness was no longer the backdrop of an adventurous hike. It had become a vast, indifferent stage where life and death collided without warning. Her boots pressed into the dirt path, leaving faint imprints that seemed to whisper of survival. But her mind reeled with the images she could not erase. Brian's desperate struggle, the bear's unrelenting power, the silence that followed. The weight of those memories pressed against her chest, threatening to suffocate her with every breath. The forest around her felt endless, its shadows stretching like watchful eyes. She strained her ears for any sound, a snapping branch, the shuffle of paws, that might signal the bear's return. The silence, though, was deceptive. It offered no comfort, only the possibility that danger lurked just beyond the next bend. She moved cautiously, her body taut with fear, each nerve alive to the possibility of another encounter. Her heart pounded not just from exertion, but from the constant awareness that at any moment the wilderness could demand more from her than she had left to give. As the trail wound through a meadow, the golden grasses swayed gently in the breeze, their beauty mocking the horror she carried inside. A herd of bison grazed in the distance, their hulking shapes peaceful against the horizon. Marilyn paused for a moment, watching them with a hollow gaze. The sight should have been awe-inspiring, but all she felt was the sharp contrast between their calm existence and the chaos she had endured. Nature, she realized, held no malice, yet it offered no mercy either. It was both magnificent and merciless, a truth she now understood in the deepest sense. Her body ached, but adrenaline kept her moving. She replayed every step she and Brian had taken earlier that day, the excitement with which they had set out, the laughter they had shared. Those memories twisted into daggers, reminding her that she was returning alone. The trail seemed longer now, every curve stretching into infinity, as if the park itself sought to trap her in its endless expanse. Her only anchor was the thought of reaching safety, of finding someone, anyone, who could help. Eventually, the faintest sound reached her ears, the distant voices of other hikers. At first she doubted her senses, thinking the grief had conjured illusions. But as she pressed on, the voices grew clearer, carried by the wind. Relief surged through her like a lifeline. For the first time since the attack, hope flickered. She followed the sounds, her steps quickening, until she spotted figures in the distance, other visitors to the park, unaware of the tragedy that had just unfolded only a short distance away. As she drew closer, her body betrayed the weight of what she had endured. She stumbled forward, her voice breaking as she tried to call out, but only a strangled sound escaped her lips. The hikers turned, their faces shifting from curiosity to alarm as they saw her pale complexion, the terror etched into her eyes, the tremble in her every movement. Marilyn collapsed to her knees before them, words spilling out in fragments, a desperate attempt to convey the horror she had witnessed. And in that moment, the solitude of her nightmare broke. Others were there to listen, to understand, to begin the process of facing the unfathomable truth of what had happened on the trail. The hikers who found Marilyn were stunned by her condition. Her clothes were streaked with dirt, her face pale and tear-streaked, and her words tumbled out in fragments that painted a picture too grim to fully comprehend. "Bear, my husband, attacked," she gasped, clutching her chest as if trying to hold together the pieces of her shattered reality. The group exchanged horrified glances, instantly aware that this was no ordinary emergency. It was a life-and-death encounter in the heart of Yellowstone. One of them knelt beside her, offering water, while another quickly pulled out a cell phone, desperately searching for a signal in the remote wilderness. The effort was futile. Reception was scarce here, and they all knew it. The only option was to act fast and return to a ranger station. With shaky legs and a heart still pounding in terror, Marilyn allowed herself to be guided by the group. They moved as quickly as possible along the trail, their senses heightened by the knowledge that the grizzly could still be nearby. Every rustle in the trees sent a ripple of unease through the hikers. The once beautiful Merry Mountain Trail had transformed into a gauntlet of fear, each step a reminder of the predator that ruled this land. For Marilyn, the walk was agonizing. Every step carried her farther from Brian, leaving behind not only his body, but a lifetime of shared memories that had ended in an instant. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a junction where other visitors occasionally passed. There, the hikers managed to flag down more people, spreading the word of the attack like wildfire. Shock swept through the small crowd that gathered, their faces pale as they realized that the untamed wilderness they admired could, without warning, turn deadly. Some murmured prayers, others whispered in disbelief. A few kept scanning the tree line as though expecting the bear to appear at any moment. Eventually, word reached park authorities. Rangers mobilized immediately, racing toward the trail with urgency carved into every movement. For them, bear encounters were not unheard of, but a fatal attack was something Yellowstone had not seen in 25 years. Radios crackled with hurried instructions, and emergency vehicles sped toward the area as rangers armed with bear spray, firearms, and medical kits prepared for the grim task ahead. Their mission was twofold: secure the area from further danger and confirm the fate of Brian Matayoshi. As Marilyn was escorted to safety, her body trembling from shock, she felt both relief and unbearable sorrow. She was alive, but the man she loved had been left behind in the wilderness, his final moments spent in a desperate struggle she would never forget. While rangers pushed deeper into the trail, she sat wrapped in a blanket provided by rescuers, her eyes vacant, replaying the attack in an endless loop. The smell of pine, the sound of the wind in the grass, the roar of the bear, every detail was seared into her memory with cruel clarity. By the time the authorities reached Brian's body, the sun had begun to dip toward the horizon. The forest was bathed in the amber glow of twilight, a beauty that stood in chilling contrast to the tragedy it concealed. Rangers confirmed what Marilyn already knew. Brian had not survived. His death would mark Yellowstone's first fatal bear attack in a quarter of a century, a stark reminder that in this park, humans walked not as masters, but as fragile visitors in a world still ruled by the laws of nature. News of the attack spread quickly, reverberating far beyond the boundaries of Yellowstone. For decades, the park had symbolized the majesty of the American wilderness, a sanctuary where visitors could glimpse nature in its rawest form. But now, headlines carried a darker truth. A man had been killed by a grizzly bear while hiking with his wife. The tragedy ignited a wave of fear and fascination, sparking debates about the balance between conservation and safety. Television screens and newspapers recounted the harrowing details, each report emphasizing the shocking fact that this was the first fatal bear attack in Yellowstone in 25 years. For many, It shattered the illusion that such encounters were relics of the past, confined to history books and cautionary tales. Rangers and wildlife officials faced a storm of questions. How could this happen? Could it have been prevented? Should the bear be tracked and killed to ensure the safety of future visitors? The answers were not simple. Investigations revealed what Marilyn had witnessed. The attack was not unprovoked in the sense of predation. The grizzly, a mother with cubs, had acted according to instinct, defending her young against what she perceived as a threat. For many biologists and conservationists, this distinction was critical. To them, the bear was not a rogue predator, but a mother following the rules written into her very DNA. Killing her would not erase the danger of Yellowstone's wilderness. It would only strip the park of one of its rightful inhabitants. Yet for the public, grief and fear demanded clarity. Some demanded retribution, believing that allowing the bear to remain free placed future hikers at unacceptable risk. Others argued that anyone entering Yellowstone had to accept the risks that came with stepping into untamed land. Signs warning of bear activity were already present, and countless pamphlets advised visitors how to minimize encounters. But in the face of tragedy, logic often bends beneath the weight of emotion. Marilyn, grieving her husband, could only watch as the world dissected the attack, her personal nightmare transformed into a national conversation. As days passed, rangers intensified patrols on the Mary Mountain Trail. Temporary closures were put in place, and bear management teams monitored the region closely. Wildlife experts reassured the public that the mother bear's behavior was defensive, not predatory, and thus she would not be euthanized. Still, the reality lingered. Yellowstone remained a place where nature's rules were supreme, and those who entered did so at their own risk. The incident became both a warning and a lesson etched into the park's history. For Marilyn, the coverage was a double-edged sword. While some empathized with her unimaginable loss, others framed the tragedy as an inevitable consequence of entering bear country, as if cautionary warnings somehow lessened the cruelty of what she had endured. She found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never sought, her grief replayed on screens across the nation. Behind every news report, however, was the raw truth she carried alone, the image of Brian's final moments, the sound of his cries, silenced by the wilderness, and the knowledge that she had lived when he had not. In the weeks that followed, Yellowstone slowly returned to its rhythm. But for Marilyn, time had fractured. The mountains still rose proudly against the sky. The geysers still erupted in spectacular bursts, and visitors still came in droves, eager to witness the park's wonders. Yet for her, every image of Yellowstone was bound forever to that moment on the Mary Mountain Trail. She had entered the park with her husband, full of excitement and trust in the beauty of nature, and had left carrying a memory carved in terror and loss. The contrast was unbearable, how the same land that drew them in with promise of serenity had taken everything from her in a single, brutal encounter. Park authorities placed new emphasis on bear safety education after the tragedy. Brochures, warning signs, and ranger talks multiplied, urging hikers to carry bear spray, hike in groups, and remain vigilant. Yet even with all precautions, there was no way to erase the truth the attack had underscored. Yellowstone was not a theme park. It was a wilderness where apex predators roamed free, and every step carried risk. Brian's death became part of that legacy, a cautionary tale told to new generations of visitors who sought both adventure and awe within its boundaries. His name was etched into the silent history of the park, a reminder of the fragile line between wonder and danger. For Marilyn, grief was not confined to the headlines. Long after the public had moved on, after the debates had quieted and the trail reopened, she was left with the silence of absence. Every morning carried the weight of his empty chair. Every evening the echo of conversations that would never be finished. She carried with her the impossible duality of memory, the joy of the life they had shared, and the nightmare of the moment it ended. Yellowstone had stolen from her not just her partner, but the simplicity of believing that beauty and safety could coexist without cost. As summer faded into autumn, the landscape shifted once again. Leaves turned to gold, snow whispered on distant peaks, and the cycle of wilderness endured, untouched by human grief. Nature gave no apologies, no explanations, only the reminder that life and death were threads woven inseparably into its fabric. Visitors would continue to walk the Merry Mountain Trail, marvel at its vistas, and whisper about the attack that had happened there. To them, it would be a story, a warning, a piece of park history. But for Marilyn, it was not just a story. It was the moment her world was torn apart, the instant that Yellowstone ceased to be merely beautiful and became forever a place where her husband had vanished into the silence of the wild.